Okay, here is the first video lecture on the history of psychology. Required for this class is a discussion somewhat of the history of psychology. And I realize that anytime you say the word history of anything, students kind of start to zone out and they think, oh gosh, this is going to be kind of boring. What I'm going to do is, I'm still sensing that maybe some of you may not have the book quite yet, and I'm going to condense a little bit for you the history of psychology. I'm not going to make this a big long thing, but it is important to understand sort of where psychology has come from. I've already mentioned the fact that psychology has a long history but a short past. Psychology has not been around officially as a science for very long, but the influences on psychology go back hundreds, if not a couple of thousand years, like we talked about previously. Anytime we talk about history or theory or anything like that, I'm adjusting my camera here just a bit, then we have to throw in some random cute pet pictures. So that means nothing for this lecture. Just threw it in there for you. Now, psychology officially began as a science in 1879. And 1879 is the only date I'm ever going to ask you to remember or memorize in this class, because it is officially recognized as the year that psychology began. And it began in Leipzig, Germany, by a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. It's spelled with a W, but it's pronounced like V. And there's a picture of Mr. Wundt. Mr. Wundt lived from 1832 to 1920, so this gives you an idea of where in history these guys are at. And again, you don't have to memorize the dates of birth and death for any of these people, but I do like to give them to you so you have some kind of a frame of reference. So, psychology's influences go back several thousands of years. Curious as to how or why? Well, we'll start with the first person, Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician. Hippocrates is generally given credit, as I'm adjusting my camera yet again here, is given credit as being the first modern doctor or the first modern physician. And he lived from 460 BC to 370 BC. So we're talking about several hundred years before the birth of Christ. Now, Hippocrates was pretty interesting and pretty amazing, given how many years ago he was doing this. He was the first person that we know of to diagnose paranoia, phobias, and postpartum depression. And these are problems or disorders that we still struggle with and diagnose and try to treat today. If someone is paranoid, this means that they are overly suspicious to the point where they feel like maybe others are trying to harm them or to cause them problems. A phobia is an intense and irrational fear. We all have phobias. Some people are afraid of needles, or afraid of heights, or afraid of spiders, or whatever. We also know that with postpartum depression, some women experience a chemical depression where they don't want to be around their newborn children. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about postpartum depression. He was the first to diagnose these problems. He recommended the following treatments: relaxation, listening to music, baths, proper diet, exercise, things that we take for granted today as treatments. He was suggesting this, 300 years BC. Now, Socrates was another ancient Greek philosopher. You've probably studied about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle in other courses that you've taken in high school. Socrates lived from 470 BC to 399 BC. So again, we're several hundred years before the birth of Christ. The thing that you really want to take, especially for your note-taking here, because I'm assuming that you're writing this down, and you should be, the asterisk point that you see kind of like down here at the bottom, this is the main idea that I want you to take away from this. His major contribution to psychology was that everything must be open to question. Socrates was often considered the most intelligent man in his area, in all of Greece. But he would tell you that he really didn't know the answer to anything if you would ask him. He would constantly ask questions. He would try to get to the truth of something by asking questions. For example, freedom. He would say, "What is freedom?" You would give an answer. "Well, it means to be able to make your own choices." And then he might ask a question like, "Well, what does it mean to make your own choices? What is choice?" And then you might answer, "Well, a choice is, weighing out options and then making the best decision." What does weighing options mean? So he's asking a lot of annoying questions. And he also had a propensity to challenge authority. Not always a good idea, especially, during this time in ancient Greece. He was seen as being a disruptive influence, especially on the youth of Athens, because he was essentially challenging authority and encouraging others to ask questions and challenge authority. And people in positions of authority don't like that. So he was essentially made to commit suicide. But again, his major contribution was that everything must be open to question. We don't assume anything to be true forever in psychology. We want to ask questions because sometimes we discover new and different things that have to change the way that we think about a disorder or about a psychological concept. Now, Plato is the next ancient Greek philosopher that we'll talk about. Lived from 427 BC to 347 BC. He came after Plato, and he sort of set out to rehabilitate the image of his mentor, Socrates. Now, his major contribution to psychology, again, the asterisk point at the bottom of this slide that you'll definitely want to have in your notes, he was one of the first to recognize the importance of individual differences. And you might think, again, well, duh, you are all different. I mean, how is that important? But again, he is living and working during a time where it's almost seen as being important or beneficial to be a certain way. People who were more alike or shared commonalities, where this was seen as being more advantageous, especially for survival. People who were different, like Socrates, were seen as being sort of negative or bad or having subversive influence. So he was also one of the first people to point out that we learn through our senses, through what we see, what we taste, what we hear, what we touch, etc. Now, Aristotle is the last of the ancient Greek philosophers that we'll talk about. Aristotle came after Plato. He lived from 384 BC to 322 BC. He was more of a scientist than a philosopher. Socrates and Aristotle